Welcome to the Good Food CFO podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Delavan, once again joined by our producer, Chelsea Steer.
Hey, Sarah. So you just got back from a mini vacation. How was it?
That is true. It was amazing. I was with some of my family. We traveled up north to really Northern California, just below Oregon. So we got to spend some time near the ocean, walk amongst the redwoods, which is like one of our favorite things to do. And we recorded a podcast while we were there.
Yeah, we had one on the list that needed to get recorded, and we decided, why not? Let's get it done. So, yeah, if you're watching on YouTube, you will definitely notice that in this episode, you are not just sitting at your desk, you've got a bit of a different background.
Yeah, it's a very coastal kind of background for this, what is our second Never Do's episode. So we're revisiting a new list of things that I recommend good food founders never do.
Yeah, Sarah, like you said, this is our second Never Do episode. And I think it's safe to call this a series at this point because I know that we will have plenty more Never Do's to cover in the future.
Definitely, Chelsea. I mean, I think something we aim to do here is part of our mission is to sort of demystify the food industry, number one, right? Create more transparency and also counter a lot of the things that are perpetuated by traditional business media that don't really help good food founders. And so as long as traditional business media exists, I think we'll have things to say in this regard. So yeah, we've got 3 never do's in this episode. And I know I've already got some percolating for a next episode. And as we say in the episode, we'd love to hear from our listeners. If you've run into something in your business and you're like, oh, I wish I never did that, let us know because we want to share your never do's with the rest of our listeners as well.
And Sarah, you just gave me a perfect segue. Speaking of hearing from our listeners, I would love to share a review with you.
Awesome. Do it.
Okay, so this review comes from someone that we actually know pretty well around here at the Good Food CFO. It comes from Danielle Lutsky, who is the founder of Plantidote Foods.
I love Danielle. She's attended our CFO office hours, and I've had a little bit of one-on-one time with her, I think with the profit assessment, if I'm remembering correctly. And I've talked about Danielle actually on Instagram for sure, but maybe here on the podcast as well. When she was in office hours, she just made the most of it and made really big strides in some of the decision making and planning for her business. So I'm excited to hear what she had to say about the podcast.
Yeah, well, she actually sent us a review directly to our inbox. And I think it was right after we aired our episode with Melissa from City Capital. Danielle said, the last episode on investors was so juicy. And I can't wait to hear this one on my ride today. Thank you for putting out consistently high value information. I would not be as confident in the future of my business if it weren't for you.
Well, that is lovely to hear. Thank you for that, Danielle. And also thank you for calling the episode juicy. I think our last review called our podcast fire. Juicy and fire are definitely not words I would have thought would be used in our reviews, but I absolutely love it. Keep the unique reviews coming in. It makes them even more fun.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you, Danielle, so much. We loved receiving your email. And I think everyone should go check out Plantidote to see what she is up to.
Totally. Okay, Chelsea. So back in season 9, we did a news segment about the Kroger-Albertsons merger and how the FTC had filed a lawsuit to try and stop them. Right before I left for my mini vacation, as you called it, I saw a news article that really piqued my interest. I forwarded it to you and I said, while I'm gone, can you dig into this and see what you find? And so I'm really excited for you to share what you have learned today with us.
Yeah. So the article that you sent me and what got me going down the rabbit hole was really this story that we saw where Kroger and Albertsons have announced an amendment to their merger in an attempt to sort of, as one of the articles called it like sweeten the deal,
Right.
right? And try to get this merger passed through. And that amendment was to really the number of stores that they were planning to divest to C&S wholesale grocers as part of this proposed merger.
Okay.
So the updated plan would actually see, I think that originally it was like over 500, but now as of today, their plan is to divest 617 stores to CNS, with the top states like being affected by this
Mm-hmm.
being Washington, Arizona, both of which would have over 100 grocery stores divested,
Okay.
Colorado, California, and Oregon.
Okay. So, Chelsea, part of the reason, and just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page here, that the divesting of locations is happening is because of this idea of a grocery monopoly, right? Like too much ownership of grocery store locations. And so in an attempt to get this merger passed, they, Kroger Albertson said, you know what, we'll get rid of some stores so we don't have too many, right? And then maybe this will pass the FTC's, it'll be to their liking and this will get approved.
Exactly. And so in doing this, right, and turning these stores over to CNS, it uh, creates potentially competition for a newly merged Kroger Albertsons line of stores, essentially, right? And so that's why they feel like bringing that number up to these 617 stores will really show that they are not trying to create a monopoly,
Right.
right?
And for those of you not watching on YouTube, she was making air quotes
Yeah.
as she did that. And the reason we're talking about this, Chelsea, is because on the surface, one might say, okay, good. They're going to get rid of more stores. They're going to help maintain a monopoly. But the reason that this article caught our attention was because it was calling out how this is actually not a good thing. No matter how many stores Kroger Albertsons was to divest, the outcome of this merger still does not look good.
Yeah, and Kroger and Albertsons are definitely trying to paint the picture, right, of how this
Mm.
will be good for everyone. So, according to Kroger's own website, this is what I found there. The updated divestiture package includes increased distribution capacity through a combination of different and larger facilities. The package also expands the corporate and office infrastructure provided to CNS,
Mm.
given the increased store set, to ensure CNS can continue to operate the divested stores competitively and cohesively.
Now, I think most people are not going to know CNS Wholesale Grocers Inc., right? They were founded in 1918. They are the largest wholesale food supplier in the United States, and they moved into grocery operations in 2021. So 3 years ago with Grand Union and Piggly Wiggly. Piggly Wiggly, as I understand it, they purchased during a bankruptcy like transaction. So, it's interesting how they even got into the grocery industry. But as of today, they're operating 23 grocery stores and one pharmacy. In this divestiture, they would be taking on 617 stores. I mean, that is a big undertaking and quite a jump.
Yeah, and we've actually seen this before, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
During the Albertsons Safeway merger, which happened in 2015, right?
Mm-hmm.
The two corporations divested 146 stores to a grocer company called Hagen. This actually led to Hagen filing bankruptcy within 6 months of the divestiture.
Yeah.
At that time, it gets better. At that time, when they filed bankruptcy, Albertsons then bought back 44 of those locations and
What?
paid as little, yes, and for some of them, they paid as little as $1.
That is wild, but I'm sadly not surprised. $1. So they
Yeah.
divested and then they bought back 44 locations at $1 or as little as $1.
And then we also saw within that bankruptcy, that 10 other locations closed permanently,
Mm-hmm.
and 17 more were actually converted to either like hardware stores or gyms, or I think in one case there was like one got converted to a hotel, but they were definitely not any businesses that were selling food.
Right.
So, this story, the story of Hagen,
Yeah.
has actually become a key piece of evidence in the FTC's case against the Albertsons Kroger merger, which actually heads into trial this month on the 26th in Portland. Kroger and Albertsons will argue that Hagen's and the CNS divestitures are totally different scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a quote here from Scott Moses, who is the head of grocery, pharmacy, and restaurants for Solomon Partners, who's actually consulting for Albertsons.
Okay.
And this is from the Bloomberg article, which is one of the articles that we're going to have linked in the show notes that we researched in bringing this story to you. So Scott Moses actually said Hagen's small size and limited capital capacity made it difficult to invest in prices and sufficient marketing. They rapidly expanded to 8 times their size.
I want to pause there for a second, Charles, and just grab my calculator real quick. 617 divided by 23 supermarkets would be 26 times growth for CNS. So if Hagen's, rapidly expanded to 8 times its size and things didn't work out well, I think I know the direction that this story is going in, seeing as how CNS would be expanding by 26 times its current size.
Yeah, absolutely. But Moses would argue
Okay, I'm sure he would.
yeah, that CNS is a seasoned acquirer, right? We already talked about that they acquired Piggly Wiggly's assets. This is something that they're familiar with. But CNS is primarily a wholesaler,
Mm-hmm.
although they do have an estimated revenue of $35 billion just last year.
Right.
But frankly, the FTC sees things differently, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
in its lawsuit to block this Kroger's Albertsons deal, the FTC actually quoted emails from CNS's then CEO, Bob Palmer. These emails were to the incoming CEO, Eric Wynn. They were like putting together a draft of a press release about the divestitures.
Okay.
And Bob actually said, do we have to say that we won't close stores? And in the parentheses, it says the all, in quotes, is a problem.
Right.
The trick is that they stay open as they transition, but then what? Are we committed to this?
The trick is?
So this is CNS. Yes.
Okay.
So you're hearing right here in these emails that CNS isn't necessarily even committed to these stores staying open, is what it sounds like they're saying.
Yeah.
But then we hear from CNS saying that they are, in quotes, deeply committed to its retail expansion. This was a quote from Lauren Labruno, who is the company's vice president for communications. Although it is noted by Bloomberg that she declined to comment on how long CNS intended to operate the stores after acquiring them.
Mm. In related news, I know that the Albertsons COO/VP is set to become CNS's president and CEO if the merger goes through. So there's a bit of a lack of commitment that we're seeing in these emails. And we know that an Albertsons exec would be moving over into CNS's lead role, which seems like an absolute conflict of interest.
Absolutely, right? And it also says to me, or I should say, it makes me ask the question, are we really that invested in creating competition?
This is the crux of why we're talking about this, right? Because there's the idea that, okay, divesting more stores is a good thing, right? It will increase competition. And on the surface, this seems like a positive thing. But when we dug deeper, when you dug deeper, we identified that in the past, in previous Albertsons mergers, the divestiture, which is such a tough word to say, it actually turned into 30%. If we do the math, 30% of the divested stores actually ended up back in Albertsons' hands, and 18.5% of the divested stores were either closed or converted into some other type of business. If history was to repeat itself statistically, based on 617 stores, that would mean that 114 locations would cease being grocery stores and 185 would return to Albertsons. And that is a problem because we've got 185 going back to Albertsons and we've got 114 locations that will no longer be grocery stores. And as you pointed out, the divestitures are taking place in specific states. So it's not like they're evenly spread out across the country. And where the mind immediately goes and why this was an important article and story to dig into for us, because we also recently did a story on restrictive covenants. And we know that still in this day and age, if a Albertsons or CNS can have the power to keep it empty, to not allow it to turn into a different competitor's grocery store, leaving people without access to food.
Yeah, and we actually saw this happen again, going back to that deal with Hagen in the Albertson Safeway merger of 2015 that we talked about. Even Hagen's hometown of Bellingham, Washington, was not immune from this fallout. So Albertsons closed its Birchwood neighborhood store in 2016 after buying it back out of that bankruptcy, right? It
Yeah.
then closed the store. And this is, by the way, in a city that has about 90,000 residents. And this store, this Birchwood store, actually served Bellingham's most racially diverse and low income neighborhood, including the Lumi Reservation.
Mm.
Now residents have to travel nearly 2 miles to get to the nearest Fred Meyer or a mile over to the next neighborhood to find a shop. As many as 1/3 of those residents don't have a car, so they are on foot now.
That's so frustrating and really infuriating. I know from looking into the articles, kind of reading through them before we got here, that the city couldn't coax another grocer to the location because Albertsons maintained a restrictive covenant that prohibited a rival from leasing the space until 2038.
Yeah, that's awful. And we actually learned that Albertsons did decide or said they decided in 2023 to actually eliminate that particular restrictive covenant and to begin the formal process to do so in December of 2023. By late June, so just a month and a half ago, right? The company finally filed the papers to lift the restriction only after Bloomberg submitted questions about what was happening and Washington's attorney general, the attorney general's office began an investigation.
I think that's, good. Those are good steps forward. But Big Lots has been in that former Albertsons location since 2019. And they sell, dry goods. They don't sell fresh vegetables and many other things that a grocery store would sell due to that, restrictive covenant. And so filing the paperwork doesn't help the people of Bellingham.
Yeah. Yeah, not at this point.
No.
Another impact that we saw from the Hagen bankruptcy during that merger between Albertsons and Safeway was that Albertsons actually had to close 20 locations in Colorado. And 11 of those locations closed within 6 months of that merger. And Albertsons actually said in a statement that those Colorado closures were unrelated to the merger, but that the company decided to close their most underperforming stores after a year's worth of analysis.
And now, where do the people shop?
Exactly. And so this is where it gets really, really bad, Sarah. Residents of Gunnison, which is home to Western Colorado University, they only have two choices. One is a Safeway that's now owned by Albertsons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other is a City Market, which is a banner that's owned by Kroger.
Mm.
The next closest grocery store, this is wild. The next closest grocery store to Gunnison is either 65 miles to the east in
Mm-hmm.
Salida or 90 miles to the west in Montrose.
Right.
So imagine if just one of those two stores closes in this merger,
Mm-hmm.
the residents are down to one option.
Mm-hmm.
And if they want anything else, it's an hour at least in either direction to find it.
Yeah. I think the scary thing here, Chelsea, is that it seems like there is a fairly good likelihood that one of these stores would close, right? Because you've got an Albertsons and a Kroger. You don't really need to operate two stores necessarily if they're somewhat close to one another, especially if one is underperforming or the analysis and the data show that if we downsize to one store and eliminate any other competitor from moving into the closed store, then our bottom line looks better. There's a little bit more that we want to share on this merger, and I'm kind of teeing up a future news story here. Obviously, with this going to trial at the end of August, like we're going to be providing updates as they become available, meaningful updates. But there's also some information on how the grocery stores, the consultants, right, working on this deal basically are putting every Albertsons and Kroger store into one of, I think, 4 buckets to decide. Does this automatically get closed? Does this get divested to CNS? So what is the fate of the stores and how does it get determined? And I think that that's an interesting bit of context to add to this conversation, which I definitely want to do on another day. For now, I think what the important thing is here is to understand that even with the divestitures or because of the divestitures, we could see a number of stores close and tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people have a decreased access to fresh food. Beyond that, we're going to see people losing their jobs, right, due to closed grocery stores. We know from, anti-competitive moves that have happened in the past that we're also likely going to see increase in prices and a decrease in wages, right, in certain areas, if not most areas. So this is a massive and very important thing to keep our eye on, but not just that, to fight against. So if there's anything that, we can do to raise awareness, that's what we're doing, is what we're trying to do here. Maybe it'll be a good idea for us, Chelsea, to say, like, what can we do as individuals to try to change the outcome, try to support, the FTC in not passing and allowing this merger to happen. And if we find information on that, we'll be sure to share it with you here on the podcast and, of course, link to it in our show notes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Sarah, should we get to some fun?
Yeah, I'm heated up about this, but yeah, let's talk about some never do's. Let's have a little bit of fun in the episode. Sounds like a good idea.
All right, let's get to it. As a good food founder, do you ever feel like your work is done in a silo? Is it difficult to feel confident in your business and financial decisions because you don't have a sounding board? Well, in our weekly CFO office hours, you'll not only get the chance to work shoulder to shoulder with the Good Food CFO herself, Sarah Delavan, but also with a small group of your peers. Together, you can support each other through the work of building a business on your own terms. Passes are available now on our website. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com and click on services. And now back to the show. Sarah, in the intro, we talked about how we are doing another Never Do's episode today.
Yep. Super excited about this because day to day in my work with my clients and in coaching founders, things come up, right? Things come up that make me say, oh, you shouldn't do that, or I don't recommend that you do that, and here's why, right? And I like to bring those things to the podcast because if one founder is doing it, or I see like two or three founders in a short period of time sort of doing the same thing and I'm making that same recommendation, there are certainly more who are doing that thing, right? So this podcast is a place to share information, and it seems like the perfect kind of episode to share those topics.
Yeah, and I that's what I love about this format as well because we did a never do's last season and I'm sure we'll do more in the future. And I just think it's so great because as you said, you'll find these like little things that people are doing. They don't necessarily warrant a whole episode,
Right.
right? For these little coaching moments. So to be able to consolidate them all here into one episode, I love it.
Yeah, it was really fun after the last Never Do's episode aired. We heard from people on social media in particular and in our inbox just saying, I loved that episode. Thank you so much. The Shopify Never Do got a lot of attention. Some people even replied and said, I'm so glad you said something because I thought I was like not doing something right, or maybe had, my systems connected the wrong way. And that's why it wasn't working for me. And that Never Do episode just kind of helped them go, okay, it's not me. I can, stop this two-way Shopify sync, for example, and, be okay, or maybe even better than I am right now in terms of my financial reporting. And so it was really good to hear from people and to know that these Never Do episodes that are really fun for us to record are also really helpful for folks.
Yeah. And actually, Sarah, I want to jump right into our first Never Do here because when we were talking about making this second Never Do episode, we've realized that there was a pretty big kind of like the central Never Do that we kind of left out of the first one.
This is true. So, the very first Never Do for this episode, and perhaps the ultimate Never Do, is to never take or accept advice or guidance as the end all be all for your business. And what I mean by that is that when I give a piece of advice, when any expert in any field gives a piece of advice, take it at face value. Take it in, examine your business, and see if it is indeed the right advice or guidance for you. We talk a lot around here about there not being a one size fits all solution to things. There are no two businesses that grow and succeed doing the same exact things. And there's never going to be a piece of advice that applies to 100% of food businesses and food business founders.
Yeah, I mean, I can even just think the difference of advice that I've heard you give in the past for a company that maybe is cash based versus a company that's accrual based, right? So just that one, and every business is different and has a different model and a different way of doing things. And so I think you're absolutely right. Just accepting blanket guidance, advice from, experts or from business, media outlets, that is a big never do.
Yeah, I think if someone says this is the way, this is the only way to do something, odds are they're trying to sell you something. They're trying to sell you a tool, a service, a course that is showing you the way. And they don't really care if it works for you or not. They're just trying to sell you something at the end of the day. On the flip side of that, what we hope to do is help people to critically think within their business and about their business. And so we do share information, tools, insights, but never one way to do something. More so, we're aiming to inform people and educate people so that they can, as I said, do some critical thinking for their business and decide what is the right path forward for them. And you may not be able to figure it out on your own, right? And talking to other founders and getting support can be helpful in that as well. And that's what we hope these episodes are for, right? Just like I said with that Shopify example from the last episode, there was a founder thinking, I know other founders that are linking their Shopify directly to QuickBooks, and it seems like that's what I quote unquote should be doing, but it's not working for me. So they were critically thinking, but they were kind of afraid to make that change. And then the podcast episode helped them to go, you know what, I'm going to do what's right for me. And that's disconnecting my Shopify. And I think that's what we're really hoping to achieve in these episodes.
Yeah, and going back to what you were saying about people that are selling tools or one of my favorite things that you do in the educational videos that accompany our tools is you always, teach someone how to use the tool, but then you spend time talking about the different use cases or how if this, then this, if this, then this. And so going to exactly what you were talking about really working on that critical thinking piece. And here's a tool that can help you do that.
Yeah, I want to share this too. It's so interesting that you say that because in a recent office hours, I was sharing a new tool. So our Baba Yacht members, one of the benefits is beta testing new tools before they become available to the public. And oftentimes if there's a good candidate to use a tool that's in beta testing in office hours, I'll also share it with that founder. And that happened recently. We shared the tool with, I think, all 4 office hours participants. And 2 of them said, it's hard for me to use a tool that's already created. I like to think through things in a spreadsheet and sort of create my own method of calculating it out because it helps me think through the process. And I said, that's amazing. Like, I create tools for people who are not Excel experts, for people who don't have that comfort in creating formulas and creating
Mm-hmm.
their own tool to think through something. So if you have that skill, awesome. Hopefully our guidance and education helps you go, okay, I understand the concept here. Let me think through this in the way that works for me and my brain. And if you don't have, like I said, those Excel skills, you can come to the tool and I can show you how the tool works. And then you can bring your business to the tool and find your answers. So I think it's like supporting however people learn best too, right? Like if you were to download our cash flow tool and you're like, I get this and I get what the goal is here, but I think about cash flow in a different direction, right? Instead of left to right. If you want to think about it up and down, like do that, like really do what works for you. I think don't force yourself into a tool that
Yeah.
maybe isn't right for you, right? And so that very much aligns with like never accept advice or guidance as the be all end all. Don't accept a tool as the be all end all either. We have to do what works best for us, but if we are able to save a little bit of time or not wanting to like recreate, reinvent the wheel, if you will, right? There are things out there to kind of help you along the way. Sort of like how we talk about AI with Meg in a recent episode, right? Like if you kind of want to skip over the ideation process and get to the creative process or that critical thinking process, I think some of our tools do that for people and they don't do it for others.
Yeah.
That's all good. Yeah.
All right. So I love that. That's like our foundational never do. What else you got for me today?
So on the heels of a recent episode where we talked about bill pay systems, there's a never do related to bill pay that we didn't talk about there. And that is
Okay.
to never implement what's called the two-way sync between QuickBooks and your bill pay system.
Okay.
Similar to the Shopify example, I think in general, and we talked about this in the last Never Do's episode, really syncing things with QuickBooks can be problematic because it creates duplicate entries. So just to kind of provide a little bit of a recap on that, I do recommend that people sync their bank accounts and their credit cards with QuickBooks because it's the core of what QuickBooks does, right? It organizes and categorizes your transactions. So that's a sync that I love. It helps you to have your books done in a timely manner. You can do daily updates, weekly updates, your income, your accounts receivable. They all can be updated really like as close to real time as possible if your bank accounts and your credit cards are syncing with QuickBooks. But when they are, and you've got other systems syncing with QuickBooks, the duplicate entries are super, super common. So the way it plays out with a bill pay system is the one-way sync is that QuickBooks, if you've got a bill in QuickBooks, it'll get sent to your bill pay system and get organized with all of the other bills you need to pay. And then you can pay it however you'd like. The second sync is from the bill pay system. When you mark a bill as paid or schedule it for payment, that payment syncs to QuickBooks. and a bill will be marked as paid or a transaction will be created. And then when that debit actually happens at your bank, when that money actually comes out of the account, another transaction will be created. And in my mind, if we have the ability to record things accurately, pretty efficiently and seamlessly without the risk of a double entry, then that's the way that we want to go. So for that reason, I do not suggest a two-way sync with QuickBooks and your bill pay system.
So Sarah, one thing I heard you say was like sending the like syncing and having the bills go from QuickBooks to your bill pay system. If your bill is already in QuickBooks, then help me understand the point of even having the bill. I mean, I know we just talked about this in our episode, but we didn't talk about this part.
We didn't. You're right. So you mentioned cash versus accrual a little bit earlier. If you are an accrual based business, oftentimes you may have what's called a purchase order or a bill that gets created in your systems, for example, in your inventory or bill of materials system. And people who are on accrual based books will know what I'm talking about here. But basically, that system will push a PO or a bill like from the system into QuickBooks. And then it'll go from QuickBooks to your bill pay system to actually get paid. If you're on a cash basis, this is probably not something that you are going to experience. But so I'll give you an example. We've got a client who makes pasta. They are on accrual accounting. So in their like inventory management system that they use to track inventory, to calculate cost of goods sold, all of these sorts of things on accrual, they'll create a purchase order for their flour within that system. And when that purchase order is made, it'll send it to QuickBooks and go, hey, you're going to have a bill coming in this amount in probably 30 days. That PO then will push to the bill pay system. So we have a lot of visibility about an order coming in and a due date long before it's due. If you don't have
Mhm.
that sync set up between QuickBooks and bill pay, then that bill will never come over. It'll only arrive once, say, the vendor actually submits the bill. But oftentimes it's payable very quickly at that point. So that's how a bill would get from QuickBooks to your bill pay system. I think on that note, something that's good to talk about here too, Chelsea, is that QuickBooks has its own sort of bill pay system within its software now. And if you were to go back and listen to the bill pay episode, there are a couple of things that I recommend as like essential and sort of like must haves for a bill pay system to be considered a good one in my book. One of those is that inbox where you can forward your bills, right,
Mhm.
in an email. You can have your vendors forward that. So it's just really easy to transition from an email to an actual bill and to get that paid. QuickBooks doesn't have that. So I think for me, that's a really big issue with the system is its manual uploading, manual, processes for getting the bills into QuickBooks for the majority of businesses, which is a huge time suck. It does have approvals, it does have some of the other kind of benefits, but the communication, the visibility across teams, and that lack of an inbox really make QuickBooks bill pay like a no-go for me, at least at the time of the recording of this episode. So wanted to just touch on that really quickly while we're here.
Well, I'm really glad that we got to touch on that never do, especially since we did just have that bill pay episode a few weeks ago and have some additional clarity around that. So Sarah, what is our last never do today?
So our number 3 never do for this episode is to never include your overhead costs like rent and utilities in the calculation of your cost of goods sold.
Yeah, Sarah, this is one I've heard you talk about a million times. I've heard it here on the podcast. We've shared it on social media and in newsletters. So, why did you want to include it in this episode again?
Because I've been seeing it in my client work, in my coaching work over the last 2 months or so. There have been a couple of people who've brought their cost of goods sold. And really what sparked it for me this time is people saying, oh, my COGS are so high. My cost of goods sold are so
Mm,
high. And typically we'll say, okay, let's examine that. And when they sort of open the books and they're showing me the numbers, I see things like rent, like utilities, sometimes insurances, right? These overhead costs that are, they're not variable, they're fixed costs. And oftentimes people will say, include those in your cost of goods sold. And so essentially they're taking advice from experts in the industry and they're applying it to their businesses. And it's like, here's the thing, it's not wrong. It's one way of doing it. I don't think it's helpful. I don't think that it provides clear information that will be consistent and easy to track and easy to work with. And so let me explain that a little bit further. Let's say, just for simplicity's terms, that we have $1,000 in rent and a founder is including that $1,000 in their cost of goods sold. And they're basing that on some number of units that they would be making within a month. So again, to keep it simple, let's say that a founder is projecting we're going to make 1,000 units a month and our rent is $1,000. Then essentially the amount of rent that's being kind of applied to the production of each product would be $1. If production goes up, let's say you start producing 1,500 units per month, then the portion of rent that's included in the cost of goods sold per unit would go down to 67 cents per unit. It would no longer be $1. And on the flip side of that, if production was to go down to, say, 750 units in a month, well, then your rent as a portion of COGS has now gone up to $1.33. So you've got sort of this moving target if you aren't producing the exact same amount of product every single month. And I don't think that having that kind of moving target, having to recalculate your COGS on that level every single month is helpful.
Yeah, this really is tying it together for me. As much as we talk about margin here and the COGS being, a critical part of the calculation in knowing your margin, that if that target is changing every month, then you're always chasing a number that is never the same.
Right. And so the way that I like to think about it is to have purely the ingredients, the packaging, and the production labor included in that product cost of goods sold. Because if we know that for the sale of every product, we get X number of dollars of profit or X percentage of
Mm-hmm.
profit margin, and we know that our rent, our utilities and things are fixed costs, and I always make this lower, this like down there gesture with my hands for people who are watching on YouTube, it's below that gross profit line. We know, okay, I need to sell this many products to cover all of my overhead expenses, rent, utilities, insurances, you name it. I know what I need to sell, or I can at least easily do the math to know what I need to sell to cover those costs. And I know that there are some people listening who go, well, my ingredients are variable. That cost changes, regularly. My labor might even be variable if I've got one person on the line who can produce products quickly and another person on the line who can't. And it's like, I hear you and I understand that. But my argument there would be the more variable costs you have in your cost of goods sold, the harder it is to pin down what is my true cost? What is my true margin? I think for every business, your ingredients and packaging are never going to be constant. And that is something that you have to keep an eye on. And you have to make sure that they're still falling within a range that is acceptable, right? So that your margin is acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when we back up and we look at the full picture of things we want to know about our business, being what are my product costs? What is my overall gross profit margin for my business and for my products? What is my break even point? What is what we've been calling internally, here, the tipping point where I go from losing money every month to being profitable? Those things are more easily identified, figured out, right? If you keep your COGS calculation simple.
I love that. Well, Sarah, thank you for sharing this list of never do's with me and with our audience. I'm growing to love these episodes. I can't wait for the next one. But in the meantime, if you're listening and there's something that you're doing on a regular basis that you're wondering, is this a never do? Or if you have something that you know is a never do that you would never do in your business and you want to share it with us, send us an email. We love hearing from y'all. So you can always email us at hello@thegoodfoodcfo.com. We'll have that email address down in the show notes. And we look forward to hearing from you.
And I'll add to that, Chels, if anyone listening, like if a never do from this episode is resonating with you, if you're like, oh, thank goodness, I'm going to change the way I do this now, or I had an inclination, that this might be a never do, let us know. We also love to hear whenever these are helpful for you. And I also think that sharing that with the community, whether it's on social or within our Good Food CFO and Baba Yacht membership community, it's helpful for people. So the more we share, the better.
I agree. All right. Well, Sarah, I guess I'll see you next week. Looking for more content like this? Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll see weekly podcast episodes as well as other content related to the show. Just visit youtube.com/@thegoodfoodcfo.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.